Joining us now over Zoom is Colin McEnroe, the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR and a professor at Yale University. Colin, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I wanted to turn immediately to the 5th District, something that I think is on everyone's minds. It's probably the closest race that is happening tonight in the state of Connecticut. Do you just have any initial thoughts that you want to share about the direction the race went?
Well, let me just first of all talk a little bit about the 5th itself, because it's a strange district. If you look at a picture of it, it looks like the corner piece on a jigsaw puzzle. So it's got kind of a right angle, but then it's got these weird sticky outy parts, and that's the result of various kinds of negotiating through the redistricting process. It really is also the product of two districts that collapsed in together. In other words, Connecticut had, prior to the 2000 census, 6 congressional districts, and we went down to 5. So the first thing that actually had to happen was this sort of, Mad Max Thunderdome contest between the two occupants of the seats for the 5th and the 6th, a guy named Jim Maloney and Nancy Johnson. So they had to, like two dogs fighting over a pork chop, they had to decide who was going to get to actually keep a congressional district after one of them had gone. And it's kind of retained that scrappiness for the rest of its existence. It's also the tippiest of the districts in Connecticut, always. Always it's the place where it's, not a blowout. The 2nd district is the next closest to that. That's in eastern Connecticut. But the 5th is very tippy. And it's also strangely constructed in the sense that 4 different counties are represented, because of its kind of weird shape, 4 different counties are represented in it, and just in a way that might be interesting to your audience. I mean, for example, Danbury and Waterbury are the 2 biggest cities in the district. But the district also includes Farmington and Simsbury, which are sort of leafy suburbs of Hartford, and have no real geographical relationship to Danbury or Waterbury. New Britain and Meriden are also in the district. Okay, that's enough boring prattling on about it. So in this particular race, we have Jahana Hayes. So Jahana Hayes is a 2-term incumbent. She won in 2018. She was kind of handpicked by Chris Murphy to go. She's a former school teacher, a former teacher of the year. And in 2018, she won a pretty solid victory. Now, 2018, when you think about it, that was sort of the opposite kind of midterm to the midterm we're having now. The Republicans were the party in power. They were the party in the White House. There was a particular wave of rejection in Connecticut of Trump and his policies and his identity. And so she was very much the beneficiary of that. But she ran very, very well in those 4 cities that I mentioned. But she also ran very well in the leafy suburbs. I think Suburban Women, the artist formerly known as Soccer Moms, played a pretty big role in helping her there. And that process kind of repeated itself in 2020. Now you've got a presidential year. Biden's at the top of the ticket. Trump is still there, having whatever effect he has on people. And so this is unusual because it's a midterm election that is structurally leaning toward the idea of rejecting the party in power, which is now the Democrats, not the Republicans. I mean, that's kind of what happens in midterms. Trump is, for the first time in Hayes' political career, not on the ballot. And she's also facing in George Logan, a better opponent than she's had in the past. Logan himself is a former legislator. He's also, I don't want to say that there's like a typical kind of person who's either a Republican or not a Republican, but, Logan is a guy who, among other things, fronts a Jimi Hendrix tribute band, which is like, I know Dylan's would be very appealing to you, and apparently he's pretty good too. Like, he plays the Hendrix guitar parts and stuff like that. So he's not, to the extent that we think of maybe Republicans being not particularly funky compared to Democrats, Logan might be a little bit of a difference there. But this is a district where there haven't been, no disrespect intended, but there haven't been really strong Republican candidates. On those rare occasions in the 5th where there's a good one, you have a very different kind of race. So there's 3 or 4 different things that are kind of going against Hayes than what she's had to cope with in the past. And I think that's part of what makes this a very tight race.
Yeah, and I was, you answered my question. I was going to ask what made Johanna Hayes such a strong candidate originally. So I want to look at how you think Johanna Hayes is going to do. I mean, between Logan and Hayes, there's not as much of a stark difference as there would be between, say, a John Fetterman and a Mehmet Oz. They're a lot more similar, both in identity, but in stance as well. And although Hayes attacked Logan during the debate for his social stances, Logan has kind of positioned himself very uniquely in a way where he's, socially liberal but fiscally conservative. Do you think that their similar-ish stances in social standing are going to keep Hayes from potentially attracting the voters that she would get if she was against, say, a Trump-esque candidate?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, just go back to Hayes' appeal. She has a lot of other things that you can't teach. She has a certain amount of charisma. If you've ever seen her, she's an attractive person with just a terrific smile. And these are a very pleasant speaking voice. These are all superficial considerations, but politics partly runs off of superficial considerations. So, there's ways in which she was minted to become, a pretty good politician. Now, fairly or otherwise, and I think we all agree that women of color are sometimes judged by different standards, but fairly or otherwise, within her own party, she has a reputation of being kind of a borderline lackluster candidate. There's like a sense that in terms of the work that you do, in terms of visibility in your district and getting your ground game together and all that kind of stuff, that she's not necessarily as rabid as maybe Democratic insiders would like her to be. But I actually think we're now at a point, you correctly say that there isn't a stark ideological difference between these two candidates. It's kind of thrilling in a way, if you know the history of Connecticut politics, to have two people of color running for a congressional office. I'm fairly certain that's never happened before. In fact, I'm entirely certain it's never happened before. Logan's not a far right guy, quite the opposite. And in fact, he sometimes alarms members of his party by seeming almost not quite Republican enough. He says stuff that makes them think that. This race won't be determined on ideology. And a lot of it at this point, I'm about to say something to you that you shouldn't let political pundits say, because they just say it all the time, but I'm going to say it anyway. This is really kind of coming down to who shows up today, who turnout, ground game. That's what this race, usually by election day, most races, if they're close, have become about this. And so the questions now are, is that suburban woman or that working class person in Danbury who might have been enthusiastic about Hayes in the past, are those people looking at their bills and trying to figure out how to pay them and looking at how much groceries and soccer cleats cost and how much it costs to gas up the SUV? Are they feeling really different about their reality in such a way that they might not be enthusiastic about turning up at all, or they might be less enthusiastic about voting for the incumbent in their district? And really, as the night goes on, we'll probably get little snapshots of how that's going. Long before we know how this race actually comes out, we'll at least know, what the turnout's like in certain areas. We can probably watch. Sorry,
you're good.
It's not going. Stop it. We'll probably know, what constituencies are showing up. Oh, I was going to say we'll probably know from some of the legislative races that get decided earlier what's going on out there. For example, there are particular legislative races where I would expect suburban women voters to play a pretty big role, and some of them are in the fifth. And if they don't show up, for those candidates, that's bad news for Hayes.
Yeah, and something that strikes me, especially as being someone from a swing state in the South, is that a lot of the candidates are very ideologically close. Jim Hines and Stevenson in that debate were agreeing a lot of the time more than disagreeing. And although in the first, Larson and Laser were going at it for the whole 60 minutes, they were closer ideologically than I would think a typical Democrat versus Republican race would go. Is that just something that you have to consider as a factor here in Connecticut?
Well, I mean, if you want to win an election in Connecticut, it's pretty hard to do it as a kind of hard-boiled right-wing candidate. If you think of the most effective politician in Connecticut in my lifetime by far was John Rowland. John Rowland, who, by the way, the second time he went to prison, it had to do with a race in the 5th district. So that's another wonderful thing the 5th district can do to you, is get you in all kinds of trouble. But, Rowland had just formidable political skills. And because of Rowland, we had 16 consecutive years of Republican governors. It was him for, if you do the math, him for 10 and Jody Ralph for 6. But he's the reason for all of that. And Rowland was a superb pragmatist. And so, for example, when Rowland first ran in '94, he had switched out of having a pro-life position to a pro-choice position. And somebody asked him why he had done that. And he said, because you can't win a statewide race in Connecticut with a pro-life position, which was, first of all, a very rare moment of honesty on John Rowland's part, but it's also very true. So, one of the things that can trap Republicans here is nominating a candidate like Leora Levy, who's pretty far to the right. One of the reasons that happens is we have an August primary where she collects 47,000 votes and gets the nomination over Themis Claridis. The last time Dick Blumenthal ran 6 years ago in the general election, he got 1 million votes. So you probably don't want to base your hopes on somebody getting 47,000 votes. The Republicans would need more turnout in order to probably get a candidate more like Claridis, who's enough to the center that she could give Blumenthal a run for his money, particularly in a year that, Democrats don't look that safe anywhere.
Another race that oddly had a very right-leaning candidate is the Secretary of the State. The debate that happened between Stephanie Thomas and Dominic Rapini. Thomas brought up the fact that Rapini is an election denier. I saw a statistic recently. I think 12 out of the 27 candidates that are running for Secretary of the State nationwide have expressed some form of election denial belief, which is really, it's really concerning, considering the fact that the Secretary of the State is the person who would be administrating the election in that state. Do you think that Rapini has any chance of winning, especially in such a left-leaning state?
Well, it's going to be a weird year. It would be a very weird year if he won. These top of the ticket races, these are called constitutional officers, the comptroller, the Secretary of the State, the Attorney General, and the Treasurer. They tend to sort of follow the top of the ticket. So, if Ned Lamont has a good night, usually those people will have a good night too. Rapini, I haven't studied this intently, but when I've sort of read back on it, I do think you could probably create a continuum or a gradient of election deniers. and if there were a gradient, he's sort of an election denier light. He's not quite as aggressive about it as some of the people in other states and other races.
And like you mentioned, top of the ticket, Ned Lamont's race, the governor's race in Connecticut is, though not as close as a race like in Georgia between Stacey Abrams and incumbent Brian Kemp, is still going to be reasonably close. Do you see any scenario where Stefanowski pulls out a win tonight?
Oh, yeah. And certainly after 2016, we've all learned not to say there's no way something could happen. And Stefanowski, they're not that far apart in the polls. And they're also, I think, not that far apart ideologically. Now, what happened was, over the last couple of weeks of the campaign, Stefanowski started to see both the polls that we could see and the internal polls that we can't see. And I don't know if you've ever covered or experienced boxing, but in the world of prize fighting, there's a moment where one fighter realizes, courtesy of his own instincts, or usually his corner will tell them, you're so far behind on all three cards, you cannot win this fight on points. You have no choice but to go for a knockout. And you can watch the fighter will actually change tactics right away and start stalking around looking for that knockout. And that's what's happened with Stefanowski. He's far enough back so that he just started trying things. I think in reality, he's run as kind of a center-right Republican who's emphatically pro-choice and all for preserving Roe v. Wade. But then, down the last couple of weeks, that just wasn't working. And so he did the opposite of what most candidates do. Usually you run to the extreme during your primary, so you get the nomination, and then you run towards the center and the general. He kind of did the opposite. He was center, or center right all the way through. And then he's like kind of doing all this kind of cuckoo bird, more conservative stuff and getting all worked up about vaccine policy and just stuff that doesn't even really fit who he was running as. But I also think, first of all, governor's a weird job. And it's weird that anybody wants it. It's really the one job in politics where a lot of people not only want to yell at you, but have like lots of opportunities to yell at you. It's a job you're really expected to do, and it's a hard job. It's an administrative job. You have to combine your own philosophy with a lot of work. And I'm always amazed that people, particularly affluent people, want to do these jobs. They always have some kind of huge psychological chasm that they're trying to fill in with this kind of public service. But so, I assume it's just really important to Stefanowski that he become governor, not because of Stefanowskiism and all of its, discernible tenets, because there aren't any. There's sort of no such thing as Lamontism, and there's no such thing as Stefanowskiism. They're not running because of their passionate political beliefs. They're running for other reasons. And so ideologically, I don't think they're all that different. But because of the overwhelming registration advantage in Connecticut that Democrats have, if you're a Republican, you've got to be terrific. You've got to have just super political skills to win statewide.
I mean, this whole time we're dialoguing about, Republican and Democratic candidates because they're most likely to win. But I know especially you on your show kind of dove into third parties and the realities that they present for the election. There are a few uniquely Connecticut things that I wanted to ask you about. First off is the Working Families Party. I know Lamont secured the line for the Working Families Party earlier this month. Does the third party endorsement really play that much of an advantage for Lamont?
It can. I'm not sure WFP does that much for him. The analogy that I've used at times for people who watch The Sopranos, in The Sopranos, all of the guys in Tony's orbit, they have their wives and then they have their gumars that they see on the side. And so like these third parties have kind of turned into gumars, they, instead of nominating their own candidates, they sort of date, somebody. And so Working Families Party does that with Ned. And he's got a couple of other endorsements, including Griebel Frank, which I think we'll probably talk about. But, it's unclear to me. Just Stefanowski, for example, the previous cycle in 2018, he was on the line, not only on the Republican line, but on the independent party line. The independent party is by far the biggest party, third party or minor party in Connecticut in terms of registration. And that was worth 35,000 votes. Now, would he have gotten some of those 35,000 votes just on the Republican line if the independent party line didn't exist? Yeah, probably. But so, in a close race, he lost by more than that. But in a close race, sure, there's something that you have that could get somebody to vote for you who wouldn't otherwise. And if there could be 20, 30, 40,000 of those somebodies, you're not going to turn down that gift.
And I mean, you spent clearly a lot of time delving into third parties and the role that they play in American democracy, especially in Connecticut. Especially after your last show about it, did you have any major takeaways on what this would mean for an election or just in general?
I mean, the major takeaway is how hard this is. I'm not saying it's impossible. And certainly out in Utah with the Evan McMullen candidacy, you have an example of a minor party candidate. Now, the reason McMullen is formidable is because there isn't a Democrat. The minute you have three parties, it just gets complicated. And, what they tend to do is either bleed away an advantage from one of the major parties or not make a difference at all. You can go back to 1992, Ross Perot was running for president. It's unclear. Republicans will tell you that he hurt Bush 41 enough so that Clinton won. It's not 100% clear that that happened. I mean, in 2000, it's indisputable that Ralph Nader's presence on the ticket, by the time the whole debacle in Florida was unfolding, it was really pretty significant that Ralph was there and that, he was getting some votes that presumably Gore would have otherwise gotten. So, I mean, they've been spoilers in the past. But I also feel like Americans are burned out on parties now that don't really generate interesting options for them. And I think, the Independent Party this time made a point of really not nominating independent candidates. I mean, they had to fight Stefanowski over that. He thought he should be running on that line again and went to court. But with Hodeling and Beckett as governor and lieutenant governor nominee, they're at least offering people, let's say that you believe, as I just said, that there isn't that much difference between Stefanowski and Lamont. These are two affluent white guys who, sort of have centrist views. They're not longtime public servants, know a lot about government. They're guys who are doing this for whatever reason. Let's say you want more choice than that. I mean, then maybe it does become important that there's something else on the ballot. And, I don't know Hodeling all that well. I know Chip Beckett because he's a former Republican and a guy who really did, because of Trump, feel as though he couldn't stay in his own party anymore. But I think there's a real value to offering people those options. I think it's very hard for them to win a statewide race, but you might see them. So let me just say one more thing about that, which is that the Griebel-Frank ticket, which is they've secured a ballot line because Oz Griebel, the last gubernatorial cycle, now late Oz Griebel, who was a terrific guy, a really nice guy, a guy with a background in banking and then kind of became more of a kind of Chamber of Commerce kind of guy, but a very sweet, pleasant guy. He ran an independent candidacy. I didn't really go anywhere, but it went far enough to qualify for a ballot line. Now that line, they did a weird thing. So Andrew Yang and Christine Todd Whitman have started this thing called the Forward Party, which is the newest third party. And they don't have any platform, they don't have any policies, except that they want things like ranked choice voting. So in order to get their endorsement, you basically have to, it's like going through a fraternity hazing or something. You have to prove that you believe in ranked choice voting. So Lamont did that for the explicit purpose of getting that particular endorsement. And Andrew Yang told me that he thinks that the Griebel-Frank line in Connecticut will ultimately become the Forward Party. But I don't know. I would just like to see third parties done better. I'd like to see them get better organized, have more concrete platforms that are identifiable and distinguishable from the mainstream. I think they're important. I think they play an important role. I don't think they do play an important role right now.
So you're talking about how you would like to see third parties done better. Do you think that the future of third parties is rallying behind, in local races, behind a strong community figure like Oz Griebel?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts there. It starts with knowing who really is in your community. But it really does involve carving out an identity, carving out a really specific identity. And I mean, the Independent Party is like a weird party in Connecticut because, first of all, I think a lot of people belong to it because they think they were checking off unaffiliated. And instead, they've actually enrolled in an existing party, the Independent Party. Now, the Independent Party had this kind of floating identity. It kind of depended on who was, I don't know, paying the light bill or something in their some little office somewhere in terms of who was controlling it. And there actually were two different versions of it. I think there was a Danbury version and a Waterbury version, and it was like, pretenders to the throne or something, which is the real Independent Party. But the truth is, it's never had a discernible ideology, and people could migrate to it from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. There weren't litmus tests of any kind. And that's good in some ways. But it also means that, I mean, sooner or later, you got to pick some kind of lane. You got to say, okay, well, what we really are is this centrist party that, that believes that abortions should be safe, legal, and rare, that believes that the Second Amendment is still in force, but that doesn't preclude reasonable gun control measures. And that, in other words, you've got to start evolving an identity where if I were talking to someone who was interested in getting into politics, I would be able to say, oh, you know what? You sound like an independent party candidate, or you sound like a agreeable, frank, or forward party candidate to me. And right now, there isn't that kind of intuitive recognition of what these parties stand for.
And with that, I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you, Colin, for joining us. Colin McEnroe is the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR and a professor at Yale University.
Thanks very much.